This morning, so I'm keeping my fuzzy robe on to stay warm here. We are working with Woodrow Wilson today. He is also a progressive and a leader of the progressive movement, but a very different man, very different type of progressive than Teddy Roosevelt was. Teddy Roosevelt, the ear-to-ear grin. Woodrow Wilson, as you can see in slide number 62 and on, clearly a fairly grim, serious character. 1912 election is always used as a model for what happens with third parties. Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Bull Moose Party split the vote, and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson walked in and took it with a minority of the votes cast. If you look at the numbers, Woodrow Wilson was a minority president. But the country is moving left, is moving more progressive, demands more change, and Woodrow Wilson has to move with the country. If the majority of the population demands something, then usually the government has to follow them. So here is a guy, total polar opposite of Teddy Roosevelt. He does complete Teddy Roosevelt's progressive reforms programs. He has to. People demand it. His biography, this is a guy who's so weird. If you know who Sigmund Freud was, the father of modern psychology, Woodrow Wilson was weird enough that Freud actually wrote a short book on the guy. Very strict childhood. Father was a Presbyterian minister. The Presbyterians are in a straight line back to the Calvinists. He was overprotected, born and raised in Georgia. He is a native Southerner, and that has been an issue, particularly recently. Like the Puritans, absolutely inflexible, absolutely self-righteous. He believed his way is the only way. This was God's way. So if you argued with Woodrow Wilson, you were either stupid or evil to disagree with him. I'm quoting Wilson here. "I feel sorry for my opponents because I know God is on my side." None of us would say that today, but Wilson did. He basically surrounds himself by people who agree with him. If you disagreed, you were out pretty quickly. Does any of this sound familiar? Good speaker, good writer, but again, as one of his friends said of him, clean, strong, high-minded, and absolutely cold-blooded. This is a cold fish, as we would call him today. Unlike Teddy Roosevelt, who was never called Theodore, even by his mom, Woodrow is never called Woody, even by his mom. Everyone calls him Woodrow. He has no nickname. When he courted his wife, he wrote his love letters to her in code and sent her the code to decode the letters. This is a strange guy. Got a law degree from Princeton, became a Princeton professor, became the president of the university, very bright mind. Maybe not genius level like Teddy Roosevelt, but absolutely very, very bright. Became New Jersey governor after that for 2 years. So unlike Teddy Roosevelt, when Woodrow Wilson goes into politics, he has a grand total of 2 years of political experience. He did run a university, but that's different than running a government. He saw himself as a missionary out to convert the world to his opinions. He was a compromise candidate at the Democratic Party convention. They couldn't decide, and finally they picked Woodrow Wilson on the 46th vote. So he's clearly not a favorite of anybody's party. And his real Achilles heel, his real weakness is he is a born and bred Southerner. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but at that time and in this person, it was a problem. Probably since the Civil War, and maybe not up to today, but certainly from Lincoln, the most racist president we had. Not so much openly racist. We found out a lot of this later. This is why Woodrow Wilson's statue is being taken down in many places, including on the Mall at UT. It was just taken down 2 years ago. I'm not sure why they put him up there other than he was a native Southerner. He had nothing to do with Texas. So I'm not sure what the story is with that, but he's gone. It is during Wilson's presidency that the KKK begins to explode and recruits and becomes much, much bigger. What does he do about the KKK? Absolutely nothing. And all of their abuses and their lynching and their murders. More importantly, we found out much later that he is the guy who screened the film Birth of a Nation for the first time in the White House. If you look at slide 64, you will know what I'm talking about. This is a groundbreaking film in many ways because it was one of the first feature-length films. Film was very new, just being developed. So technically, it's really innovative. On the other hand, the nation they are talking about is the KKK nation, as you can see from that slide. So the birth of the nation is the birth of the KKK in the aftermath of the Civil War. And this is a totally horrendous, disgusting movie in all aspects. The basic plot of the movie, it's a little over an hour long. The basic plot of the movie is that the KKK are the knights on white horses that are coming in to save the house from the threat of free slaves, free African Americans. And it's pretty clear in there. Every African American who appears, all of them were white guys in blackface, looks like a gorilla, walks and is made to look like a gorilla, like a primate. So number one, that. Number two, the basic plot is that the African-American males are trying to steal and rape white women, and the KKK is going to come along and rescue Southern womanhood from the threat of black males. It is an absolutely horrific, disgusting, obnoxious film. It was screened in the White House for Woodrow Wilson, and according to witnesses, he loved it. So that's why his statue doesn't belong anyplace, and he is president at the time. He acted on his beliefs. He segregated federal employees, black federal employees who had just now been hired by Teddy Roosevelt, and fired those who had been hired in the South. According to either Woodrow Wilson or one of his right-hand men, he or a friend of his was quoted as saying, "A Negro's place is in the cornfield." Supposedly, this was an IRS agent in Georgia who had fired some black employees. This is Woodrow Wilson. There is no government position for Negroes in the South. Imagine Teddy Roosevelt here. This would never have come out of Teddy Roosevelt's mouth, although he wasn't perfect either. So the fact that he is a quiet racist, but totally racist, this is why we don't need Woodrow Wilson statues anywhere. There are some very good things that he did, particularly at the end of World War I, which I will talk about. In Europe, he's a great hero. I was walking through this very small town, maybe 10, 15,000 people, down the main street on one of my walks in Europe, and I looked up, and it's Woodrow Wilson Boulevard. He's hugely important in Europe, for which we'll talk about with World War I. So Woodrow Wilson is elected. Slide 65, his new freedom program. What is he going to do for the United States? He is going to continue Teddy Roosevelt's programs. He wants to return to small-scale economic plans and small businesses to help them compete. And in order to do that, you need to regulate these huge monopoly corporations. He was an active party leader with the Democrats. He believed that being too big was not right, it was wrong, and it was inefficient. Goal is destroy monopolies. So on day one, he passes the Underwood tariff, which lowers the taxes on manufactured imports and ends the very high rates of tariffs. This helps local manufacturers compete. He changed, for the first time since 1835, the banking system, and with a direct attack on the rich. He created the Federal Reserve Act. This created a national bank, which we haven't had since Andrew Jackson, and 12 regional banks. They were to be funded with public money tax money, and the goal was to regulate and balance out all of the private banks. Too big to fail was also a problem in the early 1900s. The Federal Reserve, their job was to regulate the money supply by controlling loans, federal loans to other banks, and to control the money in circulation so you didn't have wild inflation, so you didn't have recessions. This is still their job, and they're watched very carefully today. They basically set the interest rates, which right now are about zero. Wilson also instituted antitrust moves. He passed the Clayton Antitrust Act. Teddy Roosevelt had started this. Roosevelt continued. Wilson continued. Wilson is continuing a lot of Teddy Roosevelt's programs here. His goal was to end monopoly pricing and directorships of corporations. In other words, company officers who were controlling half a dozen big companies, often in the same field. The Clayton Antitrust Act held company officers personally responsible for violations to the act. So at this point, you could go to jail for violating federal laws, not your company, but the executive in charge. This is still an issue today because it's not done very often. The problem with the Antitrust Act is that mostly it wasn't enforced very well, and it wasn't very effective for a while. He created the Federal Trade Commission. This is a watchdog for big business, but unfortunately he appointed bankers and businessmen to it, so of course they are not going to rat out their own, basically. Another thing that Wilson did with the coming of the First World War is create the first income tax. We had an income tax, a small one, during the Civil War. It disappeared. Now, after Wilson, you can thank him, we have a permanent federal income tax. This was a graduated tax from 1% to 6% of income, and it was only taxing people who made $4,000 and over a year. So this is a tax very much on the wealthy because the average salary at the time is $1,000 or less. Other things that he did to help promote Teddy Roosevelt's original programs, he backed farm loans with federal banks so that farmers could get loans at reasonable rates. He expanded the federal government and especially the executive branch by appointing a lot of quote-unquote experts. Remember, this is part of the progressive program, bring in the experts to solve the problem. He appointed, and there is a picture of him there, the first Jew to the Supreme Court, and this was very radical and highly controversial. Louis Brandeis was brilliant, a wonderful justice on the Supreme Court, but he was a Jew, and many people were opposed to it because of anti-Semitism, which was pretty prominent at the time. He passed pro-labor, pro-union, collective bargaining laws. He made a union leader head of the Labor Department for the first time. Passed the 8-hour day that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to get in. First, this was with railway workers and then gradually spread throughout the rest of the economy. So Woodrow Wilson, you can thank for that. Passed workers' compensation, again for government workers first. A national minimum wage. All of these are very progressive programs. The first child labor law for children under 14. And he got to it because legally they were involved in the interstate shipping of goods. So that's how he could get it. Also supported women's suffrage. Remember, women got the vote under Woodrow Wilson. So a lot of very progressive measures, even though at heart he really is a quote-unquote Southern racist. What he did domestically, we've often forgot about, but what he did in foreign affairs was probably even more important. And I will go back to this with World War I, because that is also on his watch, particularly the peace treaty after that. His background, he had no background in foreign affairs. His focus was on national issues, but there are huge issues in foreign affairs that he has to cope with. Presidents don't get to decide with the issues they have to deal with. He promoted the open door in Asia, in China. Teddy Roosevelt's spheres of influence wanted trade open to all. The Chinese could collect and use tariffs for their own government, but it was America, again, that kept China in one piece and not being carved up among European nations. His idea, unlike Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, Woodrow Wilson is famous for moral diplomacy. Taft was not interested in moral diplomacy. Taft's diplomacy was dollar diplomacy, which is something that probably all presidents use to some extent. Dollar diplomacy means using the economic power of the United States. Trade issues. We won't trade with you unless you do what we want. We won't invest in infrastructure projects unless you do X, Y, and Z for us. We use the economic power of the United States. We are using this less in the world today, and of course the vacuum has been filled quite openly by China. China doesn't go to war to get what it wants. It uses dollar diplomacy. Some examples are the Belt and Road Initiative. China is building a huge trade links into Western Europe. One of the things she has done that I know about is China has, I think it's a 75-year, but I'm not sure, a 75-year lease. They own the port of Piraeus, which is the seaport for Athens. Why do they care about it? Greece does not have the money to fix the port. It was falling apart. China came in and said, okay, we will build the whole port from scratch. We will update, computerize, we will build the whole thing. It won't cost you a dime, but we will have a 75-year lease on it. The Greeks agreed because they have no money. They're completely broke. And now China is in control of the port of Piraeus. Why do they care? Greece is a poor country. They don't care about what's happening in Greece. This is a port they can get into Europe. They can ship things through Greece into Europe because Greece is part of the EU. The other thing I saw firsthand was in Africa last summer when I was in Kenya and Tanzania. Any infrastructure project being built, any bridge, any highway is being built by the Chinese. Okay? They supply the money, the Africans supply the labor. Who has control? The Chinese. And of course, they have huge leverage. We built this, you owe us money over whatever 20-year loans, and you don't want to play nice with us, we will call in our loans. So the economic power really belongs to China. That is dollar diplomacy. Taft used it strongly. Wilson does not believe in this. He believes in moral diplomacy. What is this? Your morals, your ideals, the character that you stand for, you use them in international affairs. Woodrow Wilson is totally an idealist. He's the flip side of Teddy Roosevelt, who was very pragmatic. Give me a system that works. Wilson is not interested in a workable idea. He's interested in what is right. He was a pacifist. He wanted to extend peace and democracy in the world. Why? Because he absolutely believed it's a better way. This was the moral and the right thing to do. This is totally a progressive ideal. He believed people were good and progress was a positive thing, and you could convince people and nations to do the right thing. He is, for moral reasons, isolationist. He did not want involvement overseas. Ironically enough, he ends up in the middle of World War I. After the Spanish-American War, America was very isolationist, focused inward rather than outward because of the Spanish-American War. And one of Woodrow Wilson's great accomplishments was, before World War I, he actually got 30 nations, mostly Western Europe, to sign on to a treaty to settle international disputes with a neutral peace commission. So this is the first time, the first example we have of anything like a UN functioning. It didn't function very well because a couple years later you end up in World War I. But it was the right thing to do, and it was a template for later on. The other issue he has to deal with is what is happening with Mexico. Mexico, chaotic Mexican politics had been chaotic for a long time. America at the time had over $1 billion in business investments in Mexico. That's a nice chunk of change back then. 1911, there was a reform President Maduro elected, and he is executed in a right-wing military coup. I am not a Mexican historian. I'm just giving you the rough outline here. Woodrow Wilson was appalled that they executed the reformist, the progressive president, replaced him with a military dictator, essentially, and Woodrow Wilson blocked Mexican ports to American and international shipping. He sent 15 ships and U.S. troops to the port of Veracruz. He bombed Veracruz, killing hundreds, and illegally occupied the port of Veracruz with about 3,500 troops. So much for moral diplomacy and pacifism, because he used a big stick as well. 1916, the right-wing dictator is replaced by another liberal. His name was Carranza. And this guy did not want American interference and control for obvious reasons. Woodrow Wilson recognized the new government, but Carranza had a lieutenant general named Pancho Villa, very famous name in American history, because Pancho Villa, to make a long story short, kind of went rogue, did his own thing, raided along the U.S. border, raided across into New Mexico, into the town of Columbus, killed 19 Americans in Columbus, New Mexico, in a spontaneous raid with his followers, also killed 16 Americans in Mexico. What are you going to do about it? Woodrow Wilson sends Blackjack Pershing, U.S. Army general, plus a number of troops, cavalry troops on horseback, to pursue Pancho Villa across the Mexican border, illegally into the country of Mexico, without Mexico's permission. There's a lot of famous ballads about Pancho Villa. He is really a heroic figure in Mexico because they chased him for months. They never caught him. He disappeared into the deserts of Mexico, and Blackjack Pershing and his men were finally recalled. Willie Nelson has a great ballad, Pancho and Lefty, about Pancho Villa lost in the deserts of Mexico. He was never found, but there is chaos along the border, the southern border with Mexico, for years and years and years. Historians estimate in the end there were probably 500,000 casualties, not always from violence, but food shortages on both sides of the border, particularly Hispanic Americans who are just devastated. They have warfare in their backyard. When the border is patrolled, the smuggling increases. So what we have out of Pancho Villa and the incidents on the Mexican border is this long legacy in American history of fear, of lawlessness, and chaos on the Mexican border. It was there really in the 1840s when we took over half of Mexico, but this just ups the ante. It has a long, long legacy and a long history in America. So Woodrow Wilson, who had very little political experience, is faced with a lot of issues that he reverted to big stick diplomacy as well as moral diplomacy. So we will move on next week into World War I and see how he handles World War I and what solutions he finds with that. Stay safe. Have a good day.